They said cutting Israeli deals in Africa was suicide. The lobbyists warned me. The businessmen threatened me. Even my own advisors whispered that I was gambling with my life. But 3 minutes ago, I signed the decree. Every Israeli deal in Burkina Faso is blocked, not postponed, not renegotiated, blocked. And Netanyahu, he's stunned. His embassy sent urgent cables. His ministers demanded clarification. His companies called in favors they've been stockpiling for years. I answered them all with one sentence. Africa is not for sale. Do you know why this moment matters? Because for decades, Israeli corporations weren't just signing contracts here. They were embedding themselves into the veins of our continent. Mining concessions disguised as partnerships. Telecom networks that doubled as surveillance grids. Agricultural projects that stripped farmers of their land while promising development. They thought we were blind. They thought we were too desperate to care, but we saw everything. Last month, my intelligence service handed me a dossier thicker than a Bible. Inside were blueprints of Israeli-backed infrastructure projects, roads that led directly into mineral-rich zones, satellite dishes wired into foreign intelligence hubs, contracts signed by leaders who never told their people the price of those signatures. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my office staring at those papers until the desert wind rattled my windows and the first call to prayer echoed across Ouagadougou. And I asked myself a question every African leader must eventually answer. Who do you serve? Your people, or the powers who fund you? Because let me tell you what I saw in those pages. I saw maps marked with tiny red circles, each one a gold mine, a lithium deposit, a uranium field. But the roads didn't lead to African markets. They led to foreign ports, to Tel Aviv, to Paris, to Washington. I saw telecom towers dressed in corporate logos, standing like steel sentries across our landscape. But behind their clean branding were systems that fed our citizens' voices into foreign servers. Every call, every text, every private word of an African family, packaged and sold like a commodity on markets we would never see. I saw irrigation projects sprawling across satellite images, fields that should have fed our children. Instead, they were fenced off, guarded by men with foreign accents, and harvested for export. The farmers who once tilled that land, they became day laborers, working their own soil for wages too small to buy bread. And here's the part that chilled me to the bone. These weren't isolated cases. It wasn't one deal, or 10 deals, or even 50. It was a network, a spider web stretching across 17 African nations, every thread leading back to the same hands. They thought Africa would never piece it together. They underestimated us. They always do. But I did piece it together. And once I saw the full picture, I knew there was no going back to the comfortable lies of partnership and development. The more I studied those documents, the clearer the pattern became. Every Israeli project followed the same blueprint: enter through humanitarian channels, establish infrastructure under the guise of aid, then slowly transform that infrastructure into intelligence-gathering apparatus. In Ghana, they built communication towers for rural connectivity. Within 2 years, those towers were routing every phone call through servers in Tel Aviv. In Kenya, they installed agricultural monitoring systems to help farmers optimize crop yields. Those systems were actually tracking population movements and mapping resource locations with military precision. In Mali, they established tech training centers for young Africans. The real purpose? To identify and recruit local intelligence assets while mining data from every device that passed through their networks. The pattern was so consistent, so methodical, it could only be the result of centralized planning. This wasn't random corporate opportunism. This was systematic intelligence colonization, orchestrated at the highest levels of the Israeli government. But what truly shocked me was the cooperation from Western allies. French companies provided the legal frameworks. British firms handled the financial structures. American corporations offered technological support. They were all feeding from the same trough, dividing Africa's digital sovereignty among themselves like colonial powers carving up maps. The pressure came fast and from every direction. First, the lobbyists arrived at my doorstep, men in expensive suits with teeth too white and smiles too practiced. They promised consequences if I interfered with established partnerships. They spoke of economic isolation, diplomatic difficulties, and mysterious accidents that befell leaders who didn't cooperate. Then came the businessmen, offering contracts worth billions, shares in multinational corporations, and Swiss bank accounts that would make my children wealthy for generations. When I refused to even hear their proposals, their tone shifted from seductive to menacing. "President," one of them said, leaning across my desk with cold eyes, "you're playing a game you don't understand. The rules were written long before you were born. And when those tactics failed, the threats began in earnest. Whispers of coups spread through international diplomatic circles. Rumors of assassination plots appeared in intelligence briefings from friendly nations. Even some of my own advisors, men I had trusted with my life, pulled me aside with trembling voices. "President, slow down. Don't provoke them. You've seen what happens to African leaders who challenge these forces. Gaddafi is dead. Sankara is dead. No one fights Israel and survives." But I remembered something they had all forgotten, something that steel and money and threats could never touch. I wasn't raised in palaces or educated in foreign universities. I didn't grow up at banquets where African resources were discussed like stock options. I grew up watching my mother count coins for bread, her weathered hands trembling as she tried to stretch our family's meager income. I grew up seeing my father's hands crack and bleed from labor in gold mines, while foreign trucks rolled past our village carrying away wealth he would never touch. So when they told me this fight was impossible, I asked myself, impossible for who? For the men who profit from our silence, or for the people who have nothing left to lose? 3 weeks ago, my intelligence chief, Colonel Sawadogo, walked into my office carrying a folder that would change everything. His face was grave, his usual military composure shaken. Inside that folder were communication intercepts, financial records, and satellite imagery that revealed the full scope of what we were facing. "Mr. President," he said, placing the documents before me, "what we've discovered goes beyond anything we imagined. Israeli-backed companies weren't just doing business in Burkina Faso. They were mapping our mineral deposits with military precision, recording our political meetings through compromised telecommunications, tracking the movement of our citizens through facial recognition systems we never agreed to install. But here's what made me realize we were past the point of diplomacy. They were sharing this intelligence with multinational corporations to help them extract better deals from African governments. Our own data was being weaponized against us, used to exploit us more efficiently. I spent that entire night in my office, the dossier spread across my desk like evidence at a crime scene. The papers looked ordinary, typed contracts, maps, spreadsheets. But to me, they felt like chains. Chains wrapped around my people's necks. Chains disguised as development and partnership. Outside my window, Ouagadougou slept peacefully, unaware that their every digital footprint was being harvested and sold. Children dreaming in beds their parents could barely afford, while foreign servers stored their biometric data for future exploitation. At 5 a.m., as the first hints of dawn painted the sky, I made my decision. I picked up the secure phone and called my generals. "Wake them up," I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to unleash. "Today we cut the web." General Cabaret asked for operational details. I gave him only 2 words that would define the next phase of our nation's history. No mercy. 2 hours later, while most of Ouagadougou was still lost in sleep, our forces moved with the precision of a surgeon's blade. 17 targets, identified through months of surveillance, hit simultaneously. No warnings, no negotiations, no room for evidence to disappear. By 7 a.m., the spiderweb that had taken decades to weave was tearing apart. The first site was a gleaming telecommunications building on the eastern edge of town. From the street, it looked like any other modern office. Corporate logos, tinted glass, employees arriving for another day of routine business. But my soldiers found something that would make international headlines, though most media outlets would refuse to report the full story. Inside, we discovered server rooms filled with equipment powerful enough to monitor communications across half the continent. Rows of humming machines, each one a digital parasite feeding on African conversations. Hard drives containing personal data of over 2 million Burkinabe citizens, their locations, their relationships, their private communications, all cataloged and prepared for transmission to foreign intelligence services. At the second location, we found something even worse, a warehouse district facility that appeared to be a humanitarian storage center. The signs outside promised emergency relief supplies and agricultural development resources. But instead of medicine and food, the warehouses contained surveillance drones, hundreds of them, each coded to track movement across rural areas. These weren't commercial photography drones. These were military-grade surveillance platforms designed to monitor farmers and villagers who had no idea they were living under electronic observation. The operation manual we found was written in Hebrew, with targeting coordinates that matched perfectly with our major agricultural regions and mineral sites. By 9 a.m., 6 more sites had fallen to our coordinated assault. Each location revealed the same sinister pattern: legitimate business facades concealing sophisticated espionage operations, development projects that developed nothing except foreign intelligence capabilities, aid organizations that aided only their masters' surveillance networks. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and for the first time in years, Africa had proof of what many of us had long suspected. But I knew that proof alone wouldn't be enough. Documents could be buried, explanations could be manufactured, and the global media machine could spin our discoveries into misunderstandings or overreactions. The world needed to see action, not just accusations. At noon, I walked into the press conference room where cameras from across the continent waited. The lights were blinding, the microphones hissed with electronic anticipation, but I didn't hesitate. I looked straight into the main camera lens and spoke words that would echo across Africa and beyond. Africa is no longer your laboratory. We are no longer your test subjects, and we are definitely no longer your blind spot. But I wasn't finished. The moment demanded more than sound bites. It demanded truth spoken with the force of conviction. For too long, we have accepted the language of partnership while experiencing the reality of exploitation. We have signed contracts written in boardrooms where African voices were never heard. We have welcomed development projects that developed everything except African prosperity. I paused, letting the weight of those words settle across the room and into the cameras carrying them around the world. Today, that changes. Every Israeli intelligence operation in Burkina Faso ends now. Every surveillance network built under false pretenses shuts down immediately. Every contract signed in bad faith is null and void. Those words weren't just for my people, though they cheered from the streets outside. They were a direct message to Tel Aviv, to Paris, to Washington, to every capital where our sovereignty was treated as optional. And within hours, the world felt the shockwave. By evening, the phone lines between African capitals were burning with activity. Foreign embassies demanded clarification with barely concealed panic. Western media outlets called my actions radical and destabilizing. Israeli envoys requested urgent private meetings, promising to resolve misunderstandings behind closed doors. But I had no intention of hiding in smoky backrooms where Africa's dignity had been traded away for generations. So I repeated my decree in plain words, loud enough for every village to hear. Every Israeli intelligence operation in Burkina Faso is terminated. Every surveillance contract is canceled, effective immediately. That sentence was like a thunderclap rolling across the continent. Within 24 hours, the ripple effects were visible everywhere. In Bamako, Mali, university students painted murals of my words on crumbling walls, adding their own messages of defiance. In Conakry, Guinea, fishermen's cooperatives announced they would no longer sell their catch to companies with Israeli connections. In Dakar, Senegal, women's organizations declared they would review all foreign partnerships for hidden surveillance components. It wasn't organized. It wasn't coordinated by any continental authority. It was pure instinct. A continent that had been silent too long finally hearing an echo of its own voice and refusing to let it die. The calls from other African leaders began that same evening. Mali's president, Ibrahim Boubacar Keita, reached me on the secure line. "Ibrahim," he said, his voice heavy with both relief and determination, "we've found similar operations in Bamako. Israeli companies with communication equipment that reports back to foreign servers. What do we do?" "Shut them down," I told him without hesitation. "All of them, today." Guinea's military leadership reached out through encrypted channels, revealing they had been monitoring suspicious Israeli activities for months, but hadn't known how to act without creating diplomatic incidents. "General," I told their operations commander, "stop worrying about diplomatic incidents. Start worrying about digital colonialism." By the end of that week, 4 West African nations had frozen Israeli military technology imports. 6 more were conducting emergency audits of foreign-backed infrastructure projects. The African Union was privately discussing something that had never been attempted before: a continental strategy for countering foreign intelligence infiltration. But here's what really terrified Netanyahu's government. This wasn't just about Israel anymore. The evidence we uncovered revealed something far more disturbing: systematic cooperation between Israeli operations and intelligence services from France, Britain, and the United States. Our telecommunications infrastructure hadn't been compromised by one foreign power operating in isolation. It had been penetrated by an entire network of allied intelligence services, sharing African data like colonial powers dividing territory on 19th century maps. For decades, they had been treating our continent like a free intelligence zone, sharing information about African governments, movements, and resources as if our sovereignty simply didn't exist. That realization changed everything for me. I understood that what we were fighting wasn't just Israeli overreach. We were confronting a colonial mindset that never really ended. It just learned to use fiber optic cables instead of gunboats. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. French companies had provided legal frameworks that made surveillance appear legitimate. British firms handled financial structures that obscured intelligence funding. American corporations offered technological platforms that seemed civilian but contained military-grade monitoring capabilities. They had turned Africa's digital development into a Trojan horse for permanent surveillance. I watched the evidence of continental awakening arrive in real time. Grainy cell phone videos of farmers in Niger chanting my name while burning fake development contracts. Crowds in Ghana filling independent squares, holding signs that read, "Africa is not for sale," and "Our data, our choice." Even in Johannesburg, thousands marched through the financial district, their voices bouncing off the steel and glass towers of multinational banks. And then something I never expected happened. Inside the usually ceremonial chambers of the African Union, leaders who typically shuffled papers and read from prepared scripts began standing up. One after another, they raised the same demand. We must review our deals, all of them. It felt like watching a dam break after decades of pressure. For generations, African presidents and ministers had bowed their heads when Western powers entered the room, accepting whatever terms were offered because resistance seemed impossible. Now, they were standing, not just for Burkina Faso, not just for me, but for themselves and their people. The morning after our operations concluded, I received an angry call from an Israeli diplomat demanding to know on what authority I had acted against legitimate business operations. I told him exactly what authority I had. The authority of a sovereign nation that refuses to be spied on by foreign powers who disguise espionage as economic development. But the conversation that really mattered happened 2 days later. Netanyahu himself requested a private phone call through diplomatic channels. The Israeli Prime Minister, the man who had built his political career on projecting strength, was calling an African military leader to explain his actions. "President Traoré," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about our activities in your region." "Mr. Netanyahu," I replied, allowing steel to enter my voice. "The only misunderstanding was your assumption that we wouldn't notice systematic surveillance disguised as development aid." He tried to explain that Israeli companies were contributing to African progress, creating jobs, building infrastructure that benefited our people. His words followed the familiar script of denial and deflection. I interrupted him mid-sentence. "Mr. Netanyahu, when you build infrastructure that spies on the people it's supposed to serve, that's not development. That's occupation with better marketing." The silence that followed was profound. For several seconds, the line carried only the weight of truth spoken directly to power. "These operations provide valuable intelligence that protects regional stability," he finally said, abandoning the pretense of pure development work. "Whose stability?" I asked. "The stability of governments that sell their people's privacy for foreign investment, or the stability of people who deserve to know when their communications are being monitored?" The call ended after 12 minutes. Netanyahu never called back, but his government's response was swift and predictable. Israeli media began reporting that I was destabilizing the region and threatening democratic partnerships. European newspapers published opinion pieces questioning my authoritarian tendencies and warning about the dangers of radical leadership in West Africa. The same newspapers, I should note, that had never written a single article questioning why foreign intelligence operations were apparently legal in African countries in the first place. While Tel Aviv engaged in damage control, something beautiful was happening in the streets of Africa. Leaked transcripts from Israeli cabinet meetings revealed Netanyahu pounding the table, demanding answers from his African operations team. How did this boy dismantle decades of strategic positioning in one morning? But it wasn't just me. It was the people. The miners who refused to load trucks carrying gold to foreign ports. The students who refused to accept textbooks that taught African inferiority. The mothers who refused to let their children inherit digital chains. The evening our operations concluded, thousands of people gathered outside the presidential compound. They came not to protest my actions, but to celebrate them. Young people held signs reading, "Our data, our choice," and "African information for African development." University students organized teach-ins about digital sovereignty, explaining to their communities how surveillance masqueraded as modernization. Even my political critics admitted that what we had exposed needed to be exposed. Opposition leaders who usually attacked my every decision stood before cameras and said, "Whatever our differences with President Traoré, we support African digital independence." That unity scared our adversaries more than any military action could have. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that African resistance was not dependent on one leader or one government. It was becoming a continental consciousness. The most important validation came from an unexpected source. Other African leaders who had been quietly frustrated with foreign interference for years began reaching out privately. Presidents, prime ministers, and military commanders from across the continent started sharing their own intelligence about suspicious foreign activities. What emerged was a comprehensive picture of systematic surveillance and data extraction that went far beyond what any single country could address alone. That's when I realized we needed something that had never existed before: an African intelligence doctrine designed by Africans for African interests. Over the following weeks, I worked with leaders from 6 West African nations to draft what we called the Continental Digital Sovereignty Framework. The document wasn't just policy, it was a declaration of digital independence. The principles were simple but revolutionary: complete transparency for all foreign investments in telecommunications and data infrastructure. Any company wanting to operate in African countries must submit to full audits by African-controlled oversight bodies. No exceptions for national security or proprietary technology. Zero tolerance for undeclared intelligence activities. Foreign operations that cannot clearly demonstrate their civilian purpose and African benefit will be immediately terminated. No grace periods, no appeals to diplomatic immunity. Continental cooperation in monitoring and responding to foreign interference. Intelligence sharing between African nations about suspicious foreign activities. What affects one African country affects all of us. Mandatory data localization requirements. African data must be stored on African servers unless explicitly authorized otherwise by African governments for specific transparent purposes. And here's the principle that has Western governments most concerned: African digital infrastructure will primarily serve African interests. Foreign access is a privilege that can be revoked, not a right to be assumed. Netanyahu's government tried to dismiss our framework as economically unrealistic and diplomatically damaging. Israeli ministers warned that African countries couldn't survive without Israeli technology and expertise. They predicted economic collapse, technological isolation, and diplomatic irrelevance. They were wrong about everything. Within 3 weeks of implementing our new digital sovereignty protocols, we had received partnership offers from China, Russia, India, Brazil, and even some European companies willing to operate under transparent conditions. Turns out the world has plenty of technology partners who don't need to spy on their customers to do business profitably. Chinese companies, despite their own reputation for digital authoritarianism, proved surprisingly willing to submit to our transparency requirements when doing business in Africa. Russian technology partners agreed to full audit processes without complaint. Brazilian firms offered communication solutions that kept all data within African borders. Even some European companies began marketing themselves as African digital sovereignty compliant to distinguish themselves from competitors who refused to operate transparently. The market was rewarding transparency and punishing surveillance capitalism exactly as we had hoped it would. The continental impact exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Morocco announced new restrictions on foreign data collection that required explicit citizen consent for any information gathering. Kenya launched comprehensive audits of all international telecommunications partnerships, discovering several undisclosed monitoring systems. Nigeria began requiring foreign technology companies to store all citizen data within national borders, with physical servers located in Nigerian facilities under Nigerian legal jurisdiction. Even South Africa, usually cautious about challenging Western partners, declared that African digital infrastructure should primarily serve African interests. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. American intelligence officials, in private conversations with African diplomats, admitted they were reassessing some of their own data collection practices in Africa, not because they wanted to, but because our framework was inspiring similar initiatives across the global South. When one continent starts demanding digital sovereignty, it becomes much harder to deny it to others. Our African framework was being studied by governments in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Countries that had never considered data sovereignty were suddenly demanding the same protections we had established. The domino effect was exactly what global intelligence networks had feared most. Perhaps the most significant change isn't visible in government policies or corporate practices. It's happening in the minds of young Africans who are growing up with completely different expectations about their relationship with the world. University students across the continent are studying our digital sovereignty framework in political science courses. They're organizing international conferences about technological independence. They're demanding that their governments adopt similar protections and reject any foreign partnerships that compromise African digital autonomy. A generation of Africans is maturing with the fundamental expectation that their data, their communications, and their digital infrastructure should serve African interests first. That expectation will shape our continent's relationship with the world for decades to come. These young people don't see digital sovereignty as radical or anti-Western. They see it as basic common sense, as natural as expecting their physical borders to be respected. They cannot understand why previous generations accepted surveillance as the price of development. 6 months after Operation Clear Sight, I can report that Burkina Faso's digital infrastructure is more secure, more transparent, and more beneficial to our people than it has ever been in our nation's history. Our internet speeds have actually improved since we terminated compromised partnerships and replaced them with transparent alternatives. Our telecommunications costs have decreased as we eliminated the hidden expenses of surveillance systems. Our data sovereignty has been restored, with all citizen information stored on servers under African legal jurisdiction. Most importantly, our citizens know that their government is actively protecting their digital rights instead of trading them away for foreign investment dollars. The economic predictions of our critics have proven completely false. Foreign investment in our telecommunications sector has actually increased as companies compete to meet our transparency standards. Employment in our technology sector has grown by 40% as African companies fill roles previously occupied by foreign surveillance operations. Meanwhile, Israeli companies that once operated freely across Africa are finding themselves locked out of an increasing number of markets, not because of political hostility or anti-Israeli sentiment, but because they refuse to meet the transparency standards that are becoming continental norms. Netanyahu's African strategy was built on the assumption that African leaders would always prioritize short-term economic benefits over long-term sovereignty concerns. That assumption is proving very costly to maintain. When international headlines screamed controversial about our actions, I smiled. Because controversy is often just truth wrapped in courage, and courage is exactly what Africa has been lacking for too long. The lesson for other African leaders is simple and encouraging. Technological independence isn't just possible, it's profitable. Digital sovereignty doesn't isolate you from the global economy. It gives you the power to engage with that economy on your own terms. But the lesson for foreign powers is equally clear and non-negotiable. The era of assuming African consent is permanently over. We are no longer the continent that says yes to everything out of desperation. We are no longer the market that accepts any terms because we believe we have no alternatives. We are the continent that evaluates partnerships based on mutual benefit and mutual respect. And if you can't meet those standards, there are plenty of other partners who can and will. This isn't anti-Western sentiment or anti-Israeli prejudice. This is pro-African pragmatism based on hard experience and clear analysis. We welcome partnership with any country that respects our sovereignty and operates transparently. We firmly reject any relationship based on deception, surveillance, or the assumption that African consent is optional or purchasable. Netanyahu's government could have chosen transparency from the beginning. They could have asked permission instead of assuming forgiveness. They could have treated African nations as equals instead of intelligence targets. They chose otherwise, and now they're experiencing the consequences of that choice. The choice moving forward is still theirs to make. But understand that our choice has already been made. We choose sovereignty. We choose transparency. We choose an Africa that controls its own digital destiny. Benjamin Netanyahu learned this lesson the hard way, but he won't be the last world leader who has to learn it. The question isn't whether other countries will respect African digital sovereignty. The question is how much it will cost them to learn the same lesson Netanyahu learned. Because one way or another, they will learn it. The age of African digital colonialism is ending. What comes next depends entirely on how quickly the rest of the world adapts to that reality. This is Ibrahim Traoré, and this is how we reclaimed our digital independence. The future belongs to those brave enough to defend it. Africa is not for sale, not our land, not our resources, and definitely not our data. The revolution is digital, and it's already begun.